providing unique perspectives on civil preparedness and emergency response. This is Mitigation Journal, the All Hazards podcast.
And welcome back to Mitigation Journal, the All Hazards podcast. My name is Rick Rosati, and this is part 2 in our 4-part series on cold weather emergency incident rehabilitation. Today we're discussing the logistics and special setup needs for cold weather operations to accomplish workable emergency incident rehab. Again, my special guest is Dr. Jeremy Cushman, the Monroe County Medical Director here in Western New York. Doc, what do you think about setting up rehabilitation operations during the cold weather? How are they different from doing it in the summertime?
Well, I mean, obviously, it's a heck of a lot more complicated, right? And just getting back to something that you mentioned earlier, dehydration actually occurs much more readily in colder climates because your relative humidity is much lower, and so your what we call really your insensible losses, meaning how much water you actually exhale in cold weather months is much greater than what you do in the summer months. So as you mentioned earlier, dehydration can really creep up on us, and even just standing out for long periods of time tends to dehydrate us in the winter months because of those increased insensible losses. But rehab in the cold winter months are certainly much more complicated. Obviously, we need to get water to them, but that water can't freeze. There's an increased desire to give them hot liquids, and unfortunately, oftentimes that hot liquid is something that's caffeinated. It's tea or coffee, and so we need to resist that temptation because all of that is obviously going to act as a diuretic, a water pill, if you will, and cause people to be even more dehydrated. But the issues of shelter are obviously profound and really important in identifying a location where not only can our personnel go that is somewhat climate controlled and out of snow, sleet, hail, or other miserableness, but also can truly doff their gear. And one of the most important parts of rehab is getting that gear off of you, getting the turnout gear off, allowing that heat dissipation to occur. And to the contrary, for those that have been on the fire ground, maybe launching an exterior attack where they're not doing much, but literally sitting on the ground with a nozzle or something, is that you get cold. And truly, the only way for you to warm up is not to go into a warm environment with your turnout gear still on, but to go into that warm environment and doff that turnout gear. And that's one of those things that we tend to forget. So the practicalities of that I know that you're going to ask next is so what can you do? And so I think there's a lot of things that we can do. Obviously, your apparatus is the first thing. Particularly if you were doing rehab in a company level situation, a relatively small incident, having those individuals come to rehab with accountability, and then relegating them back to their engine if you have no other resources available. The second is obviously if you have the ability to pull in school buses, transit buses, anything else along those lines that can serve as that rehab area for a period of time. That's a great resource, and one of those resources that I think we tend to forget about until we're already into the incident, because buses, at least in our area, can take 45 minutes to maybe even an hour to come. And so if you think about that an hour into the incident, you're already well behind the 8 ball. So perhaps even putting that in your incident action plan and your pre-plan for any type of large incident is something that you can do. The other thing that I've seen a lot of departments do, and I've certainly done here in the area, is usually neighbors or neighboring businesses are very kind when they see cold, miserable temperatures and firefighters slogging around in ice. And so whether that's somebody's garage, whether that's the foyer to an office building, all of those things at least somewhat get people out of that environment, and is usually a little bit warmer than the truly exposed environment. So even a house fire in a residential area, sometimes you can truly just knock on a neighbor's door and ask if you can use their garage to don and doff gear and to provide some rehab.
Yeah, very, very important points. And, I think many people don't recognize the important factor that you mentioned, that our dehydration increases so much more because of the humidity changes during the wintertime. And let's add to that now that our personal protective equipment that the structural firefighter would be wearing can actually add to the negative on the equation. Actually can turn itself against us a little bit, as now we're walking around, maybe we've broken a sweat, we're hot on the inside, we're sweating underneath the gear, the outside of the gear is wet or soaked, or perhaps it's soaked through, and we know that our radiant losses will be there. We know that our conductive losses will be there as we lose more heat through wet gear, and we could really end up having a problem with our protective gear if we don't get that gear off. And that's one thing that I've struggled with in some of the incidents that I've done rehab, is getting people to actually part with their gear. And then the return phase of that is when we're donning that gear again, leaving rehab. Now we're putting on this big pile of wet, cold stuff that has to be dealt with. So the point of getting us into a warm area, those logistics have to be part of what you mentioned, the very important part of an incident action plan and a pre-incident plan. And I got to tell you, it's been my experience reviewing a lot of operational plans over the last few years that many places still do not acknowledge the role of the incident safety officer and the need for emergency incident rehab to actually be in the pre-planning process. Too many people, I think, are still leaving the incident safety officer position to like the last guy that shows up, or the last person that shows up. Well, I've got nothing else for you to do, so be the safety officer. Doc, could you just comment quickly on what you think or what your ideal situation would be for an incident safety officer in the role of rehab?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. It really comes down to IAPs and pre-planning this. And to me, it's not really that difficult. Depending on your jurisdiction, whether it's a working fire or a first alarm assignment, you know roughly how many manpower squads you're going to have, how many personnel you're going to have there. So you build that in so that when you do have any type of working structure fire, that you know very well, or I should hope that you know that you're going to have incident command, you're going to have operations. Well, let's fill out the rest of that NIM structure, and let's make sure that there is a safety officer. And if the safety officer obviously needs to be paying attention to what's going on in that fire ground, and I personally think that it's very difficult for a safety officer to not just worry about safety but also worry about rehab, and that's where we're assigning a rehabilitation officer, particularly as your incidents expand. And again, that's where you have these written pre-plans, so that on a second alarm assignment, golly, I'm going to have 50, 60 firefighters there possibly, that I need a dedicated rehabilitation officer. I need a dedicated EMS transport officer, and build out that matrix so that the roles are fulfilled, and you're not, forgive the expression, robbing from Peter to pay Paul, by taking your safety officer eyes off the incident, and instead eyes on a rehab area that, as I said earlier, in winter conditions might be 2 houses down in a garage.
And I think that is exactly where we need to go. And again, if we were to add all that information into our incident action planning, our pre-planning process, we might be able to identify friendly locations or neighboring businesses that we'd be able to work with ahead of time to add into that pre-planning process, and maybe move them up on the contact list, if you will, to get our personnel in there. Thank you for joining us here on Part 2 of our 4-part series of Cold Weather Emergency Incident Rehabilitation. We'd like to encourage you to come back for Part 3, where we'll discuss the importance of prehabilitation or prehab, keeping yourself physically fit and ready to do the job in enhancing the operation of rehabilitation. I want to especially thank our guest on this series, Dr. Jeremy Cushman, the Medical Director for Monroe County and the Monroe-Livingston Regional EMS System here in Western New York. Until next time, this is Rick Rosati for Mitigation Journal, the All Hazards Podcast, reminding you to support all your emergency service bloggers and podcasters. And stay safe, everyone.